They didn't come. That's the image burned into my memory. A little white church in Lexington, Kentucky, the summer heat pressing against the stained glass windows, and row after row of pews left empty where my family should have been. Not one of them showed up. Not my father in his pressed suit. Not my mother clutching a lace handkerchief. Not my brother with his slicked hair. Not even my sister who once promised she'd stand by me no matter what. They left me to walk alone. And the reason? Because I had chosen to marry a farmer. Not just any farmer, Daniel Miller of Boyle County, a man who worked with soil on his hands and calluses on his palms, a man who rose before dawn to tend cattle and stayed up late to repair broken fences. To me, he was the kind of man you build a life with. To my family, he was a poor farmer, not fit to be tied to an army officer with medals on her chest and a name like Whitfield attached to her. My father's last words to me before the wedding rang in my ears as I stood there in my gown. He'll never be worthy of you. If you marry him, you marry without us. So I did. But what they didn't know, what would later leave them calling back voices broken with tears, was that the man they'd dismissed carried more honor in his silence than they'd ever recognize in their country clubs and boardrooms. That's where my story begins. The morning of my wedding should have been filled with joy. Instead, it began with the buzzing of my phone on the nightstand. I reached over half asleep in the little guest room of my best friend's house and saw the message glowing on the screen. It was from Dad. Short, cold, final. We won't be there. This is your mistake. Don't expect us to bless it. I stared at those words, my chest tight, my throat burning. I had known they might not come, but some stubborn part of me believed that blood would win over pride, that when the time came, my father would walk me down the aisle like he was supposed to. That hope shattered with one text. When I stepped out into the kitchen, my friend Marcy was already brewing coffee, the smell filling the air. She took one look at me and knew. They're not coming, are they? I shook my head. No. She wrapped her arms around me, whispering, "You've got us. You've got him. That's all you need." I nodded, but the ache didn't leave. By mid-morning, the little church was buzzing with neighbors and folks from the farming community. Quilts hung over pewbacks, for decoration mason jars of daisies lined the windowsills, and the sound of laughter spilled from the fellowship hall as women set out pies and casseroles for the reception. These weren't people with money or influence. They were Daniel's people, farmers, mechanics, old veterans with worn caps. And they filled the room with love. But I couldn't stop glancing at those empty rows in the middle, the ones we'd reserved for family, pews that stood out like missing teeth in a smile. When it was time, I stood at the church doors in my gown, the white fabric heavy and hot against my skin. My army dress jacket was folded over my arm medals, catching the sunlight from the doorway. For a moment, I considered putting it on, wearing my service as a shield. But I chose to walk as a bride, plain and simple, with nothing but my own backbone holding me up. The music started. Amazing. Grace played on an old organ that wheezed with each note. I stepped forward, heels clicking against the wooden floor. Heads turned, I heard whispers. "She's walking alone. Where's her family? Didn't her daddy say he'd never miss it?" But I kept walking. And when I reached the altar, Daniel was waiting, his blue eyes steady his hands, trembling just slightly. He smiled at me the way no one else ever had. Not for my uniform, not for my last name, but for me. That moment carried me through the sting of rejection, through the emptiness of those pews, through the sound of my father's voice in my head, because I knew something no one else in that room knew yet, something that would soon change everything. They thought they had judged him. They thought they'd written the final word on his worth, but they hadn't seen the truth. And when they finally did, it would be too late to take back their silence. Growing up in the Whitfield household was like living inside a constant inspection. Everything had to be polished perfect and presented to the world as if we were the first family of Louisville. My father, Richard Whitfield, built his life on appearances. He ran a successful insurance firm downtown, wore three-piece suits even on Sundays, and reminded us daily that we carried the Whitfield name as if that name itself was a uniform we could never take off. As kids, my brother Michael and sister Anne learned quickly how to play the game. Michael talked stocks and politics at the dinner table, even when he was only 16, parroting Dad's opinions back to him with a grin. Anne became the social darling, always perfectly dressed, her hair in curls, her manners impeccable. And me? I was the odd one out, the daughter, who scuffed her shoes, who asked questions that didn't have easy answers, who cared more about the ROTC flyers in the high school office than the country club invitations that came in the mail. The cracks between me and my father started showing when I turned 18 and told him I'd enlisted in the Army. We were standing in the kitchen, sunlight pouring across the granite countertops, the smell of Mom's cornbread in the oven. I thought maybe he'd be proud of me for choosing service. Instead, he folded his newspaper with a snap and said, "Not for girls. You'll regret it." That was the first time I saw real disappointment in his eyes, not the kind when you forget to say sir or miss a spot cleaning the car, but deep disappointment, like I'd walked off the path he'd laid out brick by brick. From then on, every holiday, homecoming was an exercise in cold shoulders and sharp words. Michael would stroll in with his law school textbooks, Dad bragging about his grades to anyone who'd listen. My boy's going to be a lawyer, maybe a judge one day. Anne would glide in with a new fiancé every other year, Dad pouring champagne like she was royalty. And me, I'd come in from Fort Campbell with my uniform-pressed medals on my chest, stories I couldn't quite tell, and Dad would nod politely, then turn the conversation back to someone else. It wasn't just silence, it was erasure. He'd rather pretend my career didn't exist than admit his daughter wore boots and carried a rifle. The divide grew wider the day I brought Daniel home. We'd met at the Boyle County Fair the summer before, of all places. He was manning the 4-H booth, dusty boots, sunburnt neck, a smile that could light up the whole barn. We struck up a conversation over sweet tea and hay bales, and by the end of the evening, I knew I'd met someone different. Not flashy, not smooth-talking. Solid. Real. When I introduced him at the Whitfield dinner table, Dad gave him a single scanning look that said everything. Daniel extended a calloused hand, polite as can be, and Dad shook it once. Briefly, then sat back down. The rest of dinner was torture. Every time Daniel answered a question about the farm, about working long hours, about caring for the land his family had owned for generations, Dad's lips thinned. Finally, he couldn't hold it in. "A farmer. Sarah, be serious. That boy hauls hay. He doesn't belong in this family." I wanted to crawl under the table. Daniel kept his composure, finished his meal, and thanked my mother for the food. On the drive back to Danville, he just said quietly, "I don't think your dad likes me much." I laughed, bitter and sharp. He doesn't like anyone he can't brag about. But deep down it cut, because I knew Dad's word carried weight in our family, and once he'd stamped Daniel as not worthy, Michael and Anne followed suit. At Christmas, they teased me, still playing farmer's wife in the mud. At Easter, they asked, "When are you going to get serious and find someone Dad would be proud of?" Each jab was another stone on the wall between me and them. The Army had taught me discipline, courage, endurance, but nothing prepared me for the loneliness of being dismissed by your own blood. Still, I held on to Daniel. His steadiness anchored me when my family's scorn tried to pull me under. I saw in him what they refused to see: a man who knew hard work, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me in uniform during his National Guard days, who carried scars of his own from Iraq, but never let them define him. My family looked at him and saw dirt under his nails. I looked at him and saw a partner who would never let me walk alone no matter what my father said. And that right there was the divide. Theirs was built on pride and appearances. Mine was built on service and love. When I think about those years Daniel and I built together, I don't picture the fights with my family or the words my father spit like nails. I picture the quiet mornings on Daniel's farm, mist still hanging low over the fields, the smell of damp earth and hay, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. That was our world. Simple, hard, honest, And in it, I felt more peace than I'd ever known sitting around my parents' polished dining room table, with its crystal glasses and stiff silence. Daniel's farm stretched across 200 acres outside Danville, Kentucky. Rolling hills, a creek that cut through the back pasture, an old red barn that leaned a little in the wind but held strong through storms. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd worked the land before him. And though the place didn't look like much to outsiders, no fancy house, no manicured lawns, it held the history of generations. To Daniel, every fence post driven into the ground was a promise, every seed planted a prayer. I remember one evening in particular. I'd just come back from 2 weeks of training at Fort Knox, still stiff from drills, my boots barely off when I heard the clanging of metal outside. I walked to the barn and found Daniel under the hood of my old Honda, grease smeared across his forearms, sweat dripping from his hairline. The car had been coughing for months, and I'd resigned myself to riding it until it died. Daniel had it running smooth within an hour. When I teased him, "Who needs a mechanic when I've got you?" he just shrugged and said, "A man ought to know how to take care of the people he loves." That was Daniel. No bragging, no flash. Just steady hands that fixed what was broken. He had stories too, ones he didn't share easily. I learned bit by bit that before coming back to the farm, he'd served in the National Guard, deployed to Iraq, seen things he didn't talk about much. There was a scar across his shoulder, jagged and pale from shrapnel. He brushed it off when I asked, said, "Just a reminder." But sometimes at night, when a loud noise startled him awake, I'd see the shadows in his eyes. And I knew my farmer was also a soldier who carried his own ghosts. My father never saw that part. He never asked. To him, Daniel was nothing more than a man who smelled like dirt and diesel. But to me, he was the one person who understood the weight of service without needing it explained. Life on the farm wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Saturdays spent mending fences, Sundays at the little white church down the road, suppers of fried chicken and cornbread eaten on the porch while cicadas sang in the trees. I'd trade my army fatigues for worn jeans, toss hay bales alongside Daniel laugh when my arms gave out before his. And when I shipped back out for duty, he never complained. He just kissed me goodbye and said, "Come home safe." One winter night, after a long day of hauling feed in the snow, Daniel took me out to the old walnut tree behind the barn. The sky was clear stars, scattered thick as salt. He pulled a small box from his pocket, his hands rough and shaking. Inside was a simple gold band. No diamond, no frills. He looked me in the eye and said, "Sarah, the Navy taught you to fight, and the Army taught you to stand tall. I can't give you riches, but I can give you a life where you'll never have to stand alone again. Will you marry me?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. We stood there, bundled in coats, breath turning to clouds, and I felt more certain in that moment than I had about anything else in my life. Of course, when I broke the news at home, it was another war. My father's face went red, his voice rising. "An officer marrying a dirt farmer. You've disgraced us enough. He'll never be worthy of you." Michael shook his head like he was disappointed in a stubborn child. Anne muttered something about me throwing away my future. Mom stayed quiet as always. I left that dinner table with my hands shaking and my heart bruised. But when I walked into Daniel's kitchen later that night, the smell of stew on the stove and the sound of his laugh when I told him what had happened, I realized I'd chosen right. Because honor isn't about money or names on a plaque. It's about showing up when the work is hard and standing by the people you love no matter the cost. And Daniel, my soldier turned farmer, had more honor in his calloused hands than my family ever understood. The morning of our wedding dawned hot and sticky, the kind of Kentucky July heat that settles heavy on your shoulders and makes even the birds quiet. The little white church outside Lexington stood ready, its paint a bit chipped, its bell tower leaning, but dressed up proud with wildflowers from the Miller farm and quilts loaned by neighbors. The women from the congregation had spent half the night stringing mason jars, with candles, their laughter carrying out the open windows. It wasn't the kind of wedding my parents had imagined for me, no chandeliers, no country club ballroom, no catered hors d'oeuvres. But it was the kind of wedding I wanted. Honest, simple, surrounded by people who showed up because they loved us, not because they wanted to be seen. Still, I couldn't keep my eyes from those empty rows. The front pews on the left side had been reserved for my family. They sat bare, hymnals stacked neatly, Bibles resting untouched. Every time I passed the sanctuary that morning, my stomach knotted tighter. I half expected to hear the heavy step of my father's polished shoes, the clipped voice of my mother telling me to sit straighter, Anne's perfume drifting ahead of her, but they never came. Instead, I had Marcy, my friend from the army, fussing with my veil. I had Mrs. Langley, Daniel's neighbor, pressing a bouquet of daisies into my hands with a smile, and I had the distant sound of tractors from the fields, a reminder that life went on no matter who showed up in that church. When the hour finally came, I stood in the little anteroom gown, swishing against my boots. I'd worn them under the dress, a small act of rebellion. My army jacket with its rows of ribbons and insignia hung on a chair. For a moment, I thought about slipping it on, letting those medals gleam as proof that I was worth more than anyone in my family would admit. But in the end, I chose to walk down that aisle as a bride, not as a soldier seeking vindication. I didn't need armor that day. I needed resolve. The organ began to play its pipes, wheezing, filling the sanctuary with "How great thou art." The doors opened and the heat and light poured in. I stepped forward. My heels clicked against the wooden floor, each sound magnified in the hush that followed. Every head turned. I caught snippets. She's walking alone? Where's her daddy? Didn't he say he'd never miss it? But I kept my eyes ahead. The aisle stretched long in narrow sunlight, casting colored stripes from the stained glass onto the quilt-draped pews. To my left, old veterans in their caps stood a little taller. To my right, neighbors whispered, some with pity, some with admiration. Behind me, the empty rows sat heavy as tombstones. But in front at the altar stood Daniel, his blue eyes steady, his jaw tight, his hands folded as though he were holding himself back from running to meet me. The sight of him steadied me more than any father's arm ever could. Each step carried more than fabric and lace. Each step carried the years of dismissal. The Christmas dinners where Dad barely looked at me, the insults wrapped in polite laughter, the way my family measured worth in paychecks and pedigrees. Each step was a quiet declaration. I am here anyway. When I reached the altar, Daniel's hand slid into mine, warm and trembling. His smile said everything. The preacher's voice rose, filling the rafters with words about love and covenant, about two becoming one. I nodded, though my mind drifted. I thought of Dad's last text, the one that cut like a knife. We won't be there. He's not worthy. I glanced once more at those empty pews and felt the sting again. But I also felt something else. A calm, steady fire in my chest. Because I knew the truth. I knew what they didn't, that the man beside me carried a past and a strength they'd never imagined. And someday, soon, they would see it. The vows passed in a blur, the exchange of rings, the blessing, the kiss. Applause filled the sanctuary, loud and genuine. And though half the room remained silent and bare, the other half roared with joy. As we walked back down the aisle together, Daniel squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're not alone. You'll never be alone." And I believed him. That evening, when the sun dipped low over the Kentucky hills and the cicadas began their evening chorus, Daniel and I slipped away from the reception. The laughter of neighbors still echoed in the church fellowship hall. Kids chasing each other around tables, veterans arguing over dominoes, women from the congregation wrapping leftover pies in foil. It was the kind of reception my parents would have scoffed at. But to me, it felt real. It felt like family. Daniel led me outside toward the barn. His jacket off sleeves rolled the last light of day, catching on the sweat still clinging to his temples. He looked every bit the man he was, calloused hands, dust on his boots, a calm that no ballroom could ever replicate. I remember thinking, this is what they turned their backs on. This is who they dismissed with a wave of the hand. I pulled out my phone. "Hold still," I told him. He laughed, tilting his head, squinting at me. "Sarah, it's just me." Exactly, I said, raising the camera. He leaned against the old John Deere parked beside the barn, one hand resting casually on the fender. In the other hand, he held the flag-draped shadow box that contained his Bronze Star and other commendations from his time in Iraq. He hadn't wanted to bring it out, said he wasn't the type to show off. But I told him, it's not about showing off. It's about the truth. The picture snapped Daniel in his wrinkled wedding shirt, hair still damp from the summer heat, one arm holding the symbols of sacrifice. He'd never bragged about the other steady against the tractor he worked every day to keep our lives going. Behind him, the barn door stood open, hay stacked high, a life built on sweat and service. I looked at the photo on my screen and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even hurt. It was clarity. I opened our family group chat, Dad, Mom, Michael, Ann. My thumb hovered for a second. Then I sent the photo. No caption, no explanation. Just the truth in one frame. At first, silence. For an hour, my phone stayed dark. Daniel and I walked back to the reception, ate a slice of pie, danced awkwardly on the fellowship hall's scuffed floor. I laughed when the old veterans clapped him on the back and told him he cleaned up nice. But every so often, I glanced at my phone waiting. It was nearly midnight when it buzzed. One notification, then another, then a flood. My mother's voice came first, cracking through the speaker when I answered. Sarah, honey, we didn't know. We had no idea. Her sobs filled the line. I should have asked. I should have been there. I'm so sorry. Then Anne, her tone sharp with disbelief. You never told us he served? You never said? I cut her off. Would it have mattered? You wouldn't have listened. Michael texted once, no words, just a string of ellipses. Then another, he looks different than I thought. But it was my father's call that stilled me. His voice, usually so sure, trembled. Sarah, we didn't know. We thought he stopped. Cleared his throat? We were wrong. For a long moment, I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch, let him sit with it. Because for years, it had been me sitting with silence while he dismissed every choice I made. Finally, I said, yes, Dad, you were. Then I ended the call. Daniel slipped his arm around me, pressing a kiss to my temple. You didn't have to do that, he murmured. I did, I said. Not for me, for them. They needed to see what I already knew. The phone buzzed again on the table beside me, but I ignored it. I'd made my point. And for once, the weight wasn't mine to carry. A few weeks after the wedding, when the dust of July had settled into the dry fields and the corn stood tall, the town held its annual Boyle County Veterans Day ceremony. It wasn't anything flashy, no parades with tanks or television crews, but it mattered. Folks gathered in the courthouse square. American flags flapping against the brick storefronts, the smell of barbecue drifting from the VFW hall. Old men in faded camo caps shuffled in with canes. Young kids carried posters that said, "Thank you, veterans," and the whole square buzzed with that peculiar mix of pride and solemnity. Daniel didn't want to go. He never did. They're honoring people who did real things, he muttered as he buttoned his cleanest shirt. You did real things, I told him, straightening his collar. And besides, it's not just about you. It's about all of us who put the uniform on. He sighed, kissed my forehead, and we drove into town in his dusty Ford. The ceremony started with prayers, the national anthem sung by a high school choir, the crowd placing hands over hearts. I scanned the faces, and my stomach clenched when I saw them. My family. They were standing near the back, half hidden behind a group of Boy Scouts. My mother clutching her purse. Anne with her arms crossed, Michael in his tailored jacket, and my father stiff as ever, jaw tight. I hadn't invited them. They'd come on their own. The mayor took the stage, microphone crackling. He spoke about service, about sacrifice, about the small-town boys and girls who'd left these Kentucky hills to fight in places most folks couldn't find on a map. Then he began calling names. Captain Sarah Whitfield, United States Army. I stepped forward, uniform crisp ribbons lined across my chest. Applause rose, respectful and steady. I saluted, received a certificate, shook hands. Then the mayor's voice shifted. And today, we also want to recognize someone whose service and sacrifice often go unseen. A man who fought for this country in Iraq, who came home not to accolades, but to a farm he has kept running for his family and this community. A man whose quiet strength reminds us that real worth isn't measured in titles or bank accounts, but in character. My breath caught. Please join me in thanking Sergeant Daniel Miller, Bronze Star recipient farmer and neighbor to us all. The crowd erupted, veterans saluted, kids waved flags, neighbors cheered some, even whistled. Daniel froze beside me, his ears read his eyes wide. He tried to wave it off, but the applause only grew louder until he had no choice but to step forward. I watched as the mayor shook his hand, clapped him on the shoulder. The weight of recognition Daniel had never asked for was laid bare in front of everyone, including my family. I turned, then catching sight of my father. His face was pale, his lips pressed thin. He'd seen the medals in a photo, but now he was seeing the truth with his own eyes. His daughter in uniform honored, and the poor farmer he dismissed being saluted by the whole town. Afterward, as folks mingled, veterans swapped stories and kids lined up for barbecue, my father approached. He walked slowly, like each step cost him something. "Sarah," he said, voice low, we misjudged him." His eyes flicked toward Daniel, who was laughing with an old guardsman modest as ever. "I didn't know." I met his gaze steady. "You didn't ask." The words hit him harder than I expected. He flinched, then nodded. Shame written in the lines of his face. He reached a hand out toward Daniel, who had just turned back. "Son, Daniel shook his head gently, offering only a polite nod. "Enjoy the ceremony, sir." Then he slipped his hand into mine, guiding me away before my father could say more. As we walked across the square, applause still echoing in the air, I felt lighter. For years, my father's voice had defined me: disgrace, unworthy, not enough. But in that moment, his silence said more than his words ever had. The reckoning wasn't loud. It wasn't a fight. It was the sight of a proud man, stripped of his certainty, forced to face the truth in front of everyone. And no applause could drown that out. Years have a way of softening some memories and sharpening others. I don't remember what pie was served at the reception after our wedding, or what song the choir sang at the Veterans Day ceremony, but I will always remember the sound of silence that fell over my father when the mayor said Daniel's name, and the way his hand hung in the air, unanswered when he tried to shake Daniel's. That silence followed him longer than any applause followed me. Now, sitting on the porch of our farmhouse outside Danville, I can hear the creak of the rocking chair beneath me and the laughter of our children chasing each other in the yard. The smell of cut hay drifts in from the fields where Daniel is still working his figure, moving slow and steady against the late afternoon sun. Life here is not glamorous. It's not the kind of life my father dreamed his daughter would have. But it's a life rooted in things that last: love, service, and work that leaves your hands dirty and your soul clean. My father passed a few years after that Veterans Day ceremony. He never truly apologized. Not in words, not in the way I think he wanted to deep down. He left behind money, property, the Whitfield name carved into marble at the family plot. Michael manages the firm now and still chases society events in Louisville. But me, I carry something different. Not the weight of a name, but the freedom of truth. When folks in town talk about us, they don't say that Whitfield girl who married down. They say Admiral Carter or Captain Whitfield or Daniel Miller, that farmer who served. They know the story. They remember the photograph that spread quietly through the family, the ceremony that laid everything bare. The people who whispered behind my back now nod with respect when they see me at the grocery store, at church, at the county fair. I don't hate my family. I don't even resent them anymore. They were blinded by pride, by money, by the idea that worth could be measured in bank accounts or dinner invitations. But I learned the truth the hard way, and I'm grateful for it. Worth is measured in the calloused hands that fix what's broken, in the steady arms that carry you when you're too tired to walk, in the partner who stands beside you, whether the pews are full or empty. Daniel gave me that. He gave me more than my family ever understood. Sometimes at night, after the children are asleep and the cicadas sing their steady song, I look out over the fields and think about my father's words. He'll never be worthy of you. And I can't help but smile, because the man they thought wasn't enough turned out to be more than worthy. He was the only one who ever truly showed up. If you've listened this far, maybe you've carried something. Like I did the weight of silence, the sting of being dismissed, the ache of walking alone. Maybe you've been told you weren't enough, or that the person you loved wasn't worthy. I want you to hear me clearly. Their judgment isn't the truth. Your worth is not in their approval. It's in the life you build, the love you give, the courage to keep walking when others turn away. Share this story with someone who needs reminding of that. And if you'd like to hear more stories of quiet dignity, of service, of justice that comes not with anger, but with patience, I invite you to subscribe. Because these stories matter not because they're mine, but because they remind us all of what truly lasts.